is Mike Pence? Is he the devout Catholic who once told a university classmate he was considering the priesthood? Is he, instead, an evangelical Protestant who believes that creed is more important than deeds? Is he a scam artist or a true believer? Is he unwavering in his principles, or is he a political chameleon who changes depending on his surroundings? Mike Pence never had much difficulty telling others who he was. He would say, "I am a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican, in that order." Does that give his audiences a firm understanding of who he is? Christian and Republican can be found on a hospital form, a census, the superficiality of information under a yearbook picture. People who know him claim he is nice, but that word, usually describing demeanor, tells us little about his beliefs, his morals, his goals. Nice may be called into question when one considers the policy that Mike Pence pushes forward and the company he keeps. If Pence is nice, then he's Indiana nice, smiling while repressing true intentions. What is his true intention? What is his ultimate goal in life? Pence's mother Nancy once described her son to the Chattanooga Times Free Press like this: "He's a very kind, thoughtful, very Christian man. What you see is what you get. That's exactly who he is. He has no airs, no pretensions. He's a simple, God-fearing man." A mother's love notwithstanding, simple and no pretensions are not good descriptors of someone with the highest ambitions and the highest opinion of oneself. Based on people who once knew him and currently know him, based on everything he has said and done in the public record, based on his ambitions and his personal beliefs, he is a man who believes that God's plan is for Mike Pence to be the President of the United States of America. Whether Pence was led to this belief in a moment of thoughtful prayer, or he simply always had that ambition and insecurity that needed massaging, and God was simply the excuse to lionize this insecurity, there may be no way to tell. That's a question for a personal psychologist who Pence almost certainly would never hire. An investigation of his life from an outsider's perspective does seem to paint the picture of someone who bows to authority in hopes of gaining authority himself. When he was a radio show host and television host in Indiana, journalists and onlookers noted the bending over backwards manner in which he spoke to more powerful guests, earning not only television and radio advertising dollars, but influence among those in authority. When he was a congressman, he ran for minority House leader and lost, but this was widely understood to be done as a favor to the actual minority leader so that it would look like a contest and not a coronation. Pence threw the fight to gain favor with his superiors. And now, as vice president, Pence is considered a sycophant by his peers and among people who once mistakenly respected him. But this is all in service to God's plan. How could I be wrong, he might think, if this is what God wants? Pence wants to be president, whether it's God's will or not, and he has slowly positioned himself for that office over the course of his life. Michael Richard Pence was born on June 7, 1959, one of 6 children in a Catholic family. He did not speak until he was 3 years old. His parents operated a number of gas stations, and he grew up in a comfortable, well-to-do middle-class home. When Pence was 7 years old, he walked the runway at the Crump Theater in Indiana, modeling outfits for the Tempo department store spring fashion show. In middle school, he was a champion in the debate club, giving him the early skills he would need to later obfuscate facts from reporters. As a teenager, Pence's father connected him with a business associate, John Rumpel, the head of the local Democratic Party. Pence worked as a youth coordinator for a local Democrat running for judge. Pence would not become a Republican until his mid-20s. In order to give himself a common man character to voters, he would later remark on his childhood days as challenging, recollecting being significantly overweight and unpopular. But by the time he was in high school, that turned around. Pictures and records from that time suggest Pence was a good-looking young man and child fashion model from a prominent family in the community. He would later tell reporters about the cornfield in his backyard to apply that same common man characterization. And while the cornfield definitely existed, it did not tell the whole truth. Pence grew up in the city's newest subdivision, built for Columbus, Indiana's booming manufacturing industry. The Pences may have had corn in their backyard, but they were also a rising business family living in the suburbs. The corn may have been there, but he was no farmer. Pence was both an athlete and class president. This is when he began to tell classmates that he may run for president of the United States one day, the first recorded instance of Pence's ultimate political ambition. When he later attended Hanover College, he was a member of the Phi Gamma Delta fraternity. When the associate dean surprised them with a visit, the brothers hid their alcohol and evidence of partying, while Pence was chosen to greet him at the door. Instead of covering for his sworn brothers, he ratted them out, perhaps in hopes of gaining the associate dean's favor. He did, as this may have been helpful in Pence gaining employment with the college following graduation. He worked in the admissions office. Favors for favors. In an interview with The Atlantic, Pence's classmate Daniel Murphy said this of the incident. "They really raked us over the coals. Somewhere in the midst of all that genuine humility and good feeling, this is a guy who's got that ambition. Is Mike's religiosity a way of justifying that ambition to himself?" Pence's conversion from Catholicism to evangelicalism is shrouded in mystery. Pence is always careful not to reveal too much of himself to the press, or else the facade of the simple man with no pretensions might be torn down, revealing his ambition. Michael D'Antonio and Peter Eisner, authors of The Shadow President, The Truth About Mike Pence, suspected it may have had something to do with a college trip to a Christian music festival called Ichthyius. At Ichthyius, Pence heard conservative Christianity's answer to pop rock and folk music. For a young Catholic who had, no doubt, heard some awful guitar masses growing up in the 1960s, the Christian music at Ichthyius would have been a revelation of sorts. Evangelical acts at the time played loud and sang with emotion. Many of the musicians poured the drama and struggle of their lives into their lyrics. Pence was moved by what he heard and saw. A more cynical but perhaps more realistic interpretation of Pence straddling the line between Catholic and Protestant is that his future constituents were mostly Protestants, with Catholics a sizable but still distant second. Pence would sometimes call himself an evangelical Catholic, perhaps to gain support from both denominations. As Catholics are less likely to vote Republican than evangelical Protestants, Pence's religious conversion was also a political conversion, eventually registering as a Republican and running for office. However, his straddling the fence did not initially pay off. Pence graduated from Hanover College in the spring of 1981. He delivered the student address and shared the stage with President Ronald Reagan's National Security Advisor Richard Allen, who delivered the commencement address. In 1985 and 1986, Pence set his sights firmly on politics, working as a protege to William Harvey, who had famously mentored Vice President Dan Quayle. One might think that Pence was on the right track to become a successful politician, but his early political career was full of failures. His first public embarrassment was his doomed 1988 campaign for the House of Representatives, seeking to unseat Democratic Congressman Phil Sharp. When the chairman of the Indiana Republicans selected Pence to run in the 2nd District, he did not actually live in that district, and had to buy a house there to make everything legal. Pence criticized Sharp for taking money from political action committees and vowed never to use them. This was not a principled stance, and his wealthy supporters gave him more than $425,000, roughly the same that Sharp had. Far worse optics than that, Pence repeatedly missed the filing deadline to report this fundraising. When he finally did submit his papers to state and federal officials, they were full of errors. His 1988 campaign was the first sign that Mike Pence was to become the leading anti-abortion politician in the United States. He campaigned to outlaw abortion, whereas Congressman Sharp was pro-choice. This would become one of Pence's key issues throughout his career, but in a race doomed to fail against a popular congressman, and with no profile and no record to speak of, Pence did not yet attract enough of the Christian right to help bolster his chances of winning. With his back against the wall, Pence's campaign made their own version of the Willie Horton ad, a commercial and a print ad version, both with a razor blade, a rolled-up dollar bill, lines of white powder. Red letters bled over the picture declaring, "There's something Phil Sharp isn't telling you about his record on drugs," followed by, "It's weak," written in powder. Pence's fear-mongering to suburban families was still not enough, as he was soundly defeated by Sharp come Election Day. Undaunted, Pence desired a rematch with Sharp in 1990, but if he was going to follow God's path to the presidency, he was going to have to make some deals with the devil. Pence put together contacts and supporters, a who's who of the worst of the worst. In the summer of 1989, Pence went to Washington to meet with Lee Atwater, then chairman of the Republican Party and the mind behind the aforementioned Willie Horton ad and the White Southern Strategy. He was famous for his racist attacks, and he was just what Pence needed. Pence also met with Tim LaHaye, founder of the Council for National Policy and co-author of the infamous Left Behind series of novels. LaHaye was in favor of dominionism, a policy of changing the United States into an explicitly Christian nation under Christian law. He teamed up with Richard DeVos, a billionaire who funds right-wing candidates, and particularly those who oppose marriage equality. Pence also cozied up to the Family Research Council, an activist organization that opposes abortion and gay rights. It is listed as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And finally, Pence tied himself to the Koch brothers, who were not motivated by religion but solely by profits. The Koch brothers funded right-wing think tanks to spread climate change denial and paid Republican politicians to keep their taxes low. With the Kochs and the rest at his side, Pence had put together a dream team of powerful Republicans who could take on Phil Sharp in the 1990 election. Pence lost again. Part of his failure came through scandal. Pence created 2 campaign organizations to accept donations. One was a garden-variety political nonprofit, and the other was set up as a business that was able to take out loans and make payments. Reporters found out that this business made payments on Pence's personal credit cards, house mortgage, car payments, groceries, and like all American politicians, rounds of golf. When confronted, Pence snapped, saying, "I need to make a living." Pence tried every dirty trick in the book to dig himself out of that scandal and go on the offensive, including an attack ad featuring a man dressed up as an Arab thanking Phil Sharp for his support, but it wasn't enough. Pence, a disgraced political failure, had no choice but to seek employment elsewhere. After making connections with the Heritage Foundation and other conservative groups, Pence was poised to bring his variety of bland, right-wing Christianity to the people in a new way: media. Pence was offered a broadcasting position at WXIR, a small station owned by the American Bible Radio Group. He soon moved on to a bigger station that gave him a weekly show, and by 1994, The Mike Pence Show broadcasted daily across much of Indiana. He focused on abortion, teen pregnancy, women in the military, divorce, and adultery. Not surprisingly, these are all topics about controlling women. Pence's even-tempered, stone-faced grimace of later years had not yet taken shape, as he was a lot more animated on the radio and later television. Pence was particularly incensed by the Disney movie Mulan because it suggested that women could perform the same actions as men. Pence's interpretation of the relationship between men and women comes directly from the Bible. Ephesians 5:23. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Pence had remade himself. After years of claiming that he no longer had any political ambitions, Mike Pence finally filed his papers in the summer of 1999 to run for Congress once again. Armed with even more right-wing groups, think tanks, Koch brothers money, and statewide notoriety due to his celebrity on the radio, he was finally ready to not fail. Again, from the Shadow President. Candidates generally insist that their political positions and votes are not for sale and that people who fund their campaigns are simply backing the one who already supports their priorities. No one in politics believes this is true, which is why in 1988 and 1990, Pence made a big deal out of Phil Sharp's habit of accepting donations from political action committees. Everyone knows that committees and individuals give to gain access and influence. Pence's first campaigns were funded mainly by business people, many from industries like Cummins Engine, who had their own interests, but they were harder to discern than the goals of a PAC, named for a labor group, a commercial association, or policy priority. Nevertheless, the donors would make their wishes clear, and it would be understood that future support depended on performance. After nearly a decade of making connections as Radio Mike, Pence knew the big players who could give and also connect him with others who could make donations. Pence's campaign called for abortion to be outlawed, heterosexual couples to be favored over same-sex couples, removal of any funds to AIDS groups that, in his words, celebrate homosexuality, and a ban on same-sex marriage across the country, even though at that point only one state allowed civil unions and not even marriages. Pence also called for federal funds to be devoted to groups dedicated to changing the behavior of gay people. This is called conversion therapy, even if Pence did not use that term, and is widely understood to be both pseudoscience and even torture. Pence had somehow become even more extreme in his time away from politics. Extreme or not, with the help of the Koch brothers and other right-wing groups, Mike Pence had finally become a political success. He won the election in 2000, and in January 2001 he was sworn in as a congressman. Pence soon supported the disastrous war in Iraq, as virtually all Republicans and many Democrats did. But Pence's key issues were related to his Christianity, particularly his anti-gay policies. Pence voted against the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, ENDA, which would have prohibited discrimination in employment based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Pence supported a proposed constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage. He also opposed the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Pence had become the superstar of the Christian right. He finally figured out his place in the world, espousing right-wing Christian values to gain favor with Christians who believed their way of life was under attack, all the while funded by anti-tax right libertarian groups to pay lip service to their causes from time to time. Pence was never going to be Grover Norquist, someone whose focus was entirely on promoting big business interests and shrinking the government so that said businesses could get away with anything. But Pence was still bought by those organizations and business interests, and he would reliably vote in favor of them, in between his speeches warning about the encroaching threat of the gays. Pence's star had risen so much that he considered running for president in 2012. However, after much consideration, he must have realized that going from congressman directly to president would have failed. Only one U.S. president had made that jump before. Generally, presidents who were once congressmen did something in between: senator, vice president, or governor. While Pence was campaigning for governor of Indiana in 2012, his policies on abortion somehow became even more extreme. One anti-abortion measure would have required that all women undergoing abortions be shown ultrasound images of the embryo or fetus and hear a description of its condition before the procedure. Doctors universally understand that this is medically unnecessary. This proposal only existed to shame women. The proposal failed, but Pence used these issues to galvanize his base in the Christian right. It worked, and Pence was elected governor on the strength of his convictions. In late 2014 and early 2015, doctors and public officials determined that there had been a sudden rise in drug overdoses, along with a rise in HIV infection in Indiana. The Center for Disease Control and local officials asked Governor Pence for permission to distribute clean needles to addicts. By law, needles could only be obtained by prescription and otherwise were considered illegal drug paraphernalia. Pence refused, and the outbreak grew and grew, costing the lives and health of many of his constituents. Pence, like many Christian conservatives, considered HIV infection and drug addiction moral failings rather than public health concerns. After months of inaction, Pence claimed he would prey on it, and eventually relented only when public outcry was against him. By that point, however, over 100 new HIV cases had arisen. In 2015, backed by Pence, conservatives in the Indiana state legislature proposed a new law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA. It allowed for the people of Indiana to discriminate against their fellow Hoosiers on religious grounds. RFRA was a thinly veiled anti-gay law, but the language was actually so broad that it protected discrimination against anyone, so long as they claimed that they were doing so because of their faith. This effectively broadly legalized discrimination in Indiana. This law was so extreme and so flagrantly unconstitutional that governors in many states enacted travel bans to Indiana, and many businesses and sports organizations refused to do business in the state. Only under this mounting pressure did Pence and the legislature reverse course on RFRA. Pence still had his sights set on the White House, God's plan, and his rising unpopularity could have undone all of that. Only a year later, Pence moved one step closer as he was tapped by Donald Trump to be his running mate in the 2016 presidential election. Pence helped shore up support from Christian conservatives and evangelicals specifically, who had some doubts about the twice-divorced, adulterous, scandalous reality show host. During Trump's Access Hollywood scandal, Pence privately offered to replace Trump on the ticket. However, the Republican Party, having no mechanism to do that so late in the campaign, stuck with Trump. Pence later denied this attempted coup, but he was not widely believed. Following the election victory, Pence was not only the vice president-elect, but the head of the transition team. That meant it was Pence who decided on most of Trump's cabinet. Pence looked into his Rolodex and primarily chose his political cronies and far-right Indiana mainstays to fill up the administration. Pence chose Tom Price, an anti-abortion and anti-Medicare politician, to be Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. He was replaced by Alex Azar, a businessman from Indiana and fellow anti-abortion activist. Pence chose Betsy DeVos to head the Department of Education. DeVos and her family had long been donors to Pence's campaigns. DeVos has consistently sided against victims of sexual assault on campuses and has spent millions on education privatization schemes. Jerome Adams, Pence's former Indiana State Health Commissioner, became the U.S. Surgeon General. Adams had previously defended Pence during his HIV scandal. Dan Coates, Pence's friend and former U.S. Senator from Indiana, was named Director of National Intelligence. Many of the scandals and frequent turnaround in cabinet positions during the Trump administration are related to Mike Pence's cronyism and choices of unqualified businessmen and conservative activists for the highest offices in the nation. The vice president has a limited amount of power on paper, but the president can give the vice president more responsibilities. President Trump, famously lazy and unwilling to do any work, has given responsibilities to Pence. Many Republicans speculated that Pence would be a calming presence in the administration and would temper some of Trump's bad attitude, but that has not been the case. Quite the opposite. In his tenure as vice president, Mike Pence earned a reputation for being a sycophant and for enabling Trump. Most recently, he was named the head of the effort to combat coronavirus. During this short stint, he refused to wear a mask during his visit to a hospital, refused to self-quarantine after his staffers tested positive, and shortly thereafter, the task force announced it was disbanding, despite no progress being made. Ideally, there should be no president. The fact that a single person holds so much power and is nearly impervious to being recalled outside of an election only every 4 years is antithetical to democracy, but that might be a topic for another day. There is going to be an election this year, and unless the system collapses or is overthrown, there will be one in 2024. Mike Pence believes he was chosen by God to be President of the United States. He will almost certainly run for president in 2024. If Trump is re-elected in 2020, the victory will be shared with Pence, giving him more credibility in 2024. He's not thought of as a political failure anymore. Another way Pence could ascend the presidency is if Trump steps down or dies in office. In total, 14 vice presidents have become president one way or another. Then Vice President George H.W. Bush was elected president. Being vice president may not be a glorious position, but it does have a history of leading to the presidency. If the Trump-Pence ticket loses in 2020, this may hurt Pence's argument for electability. He could win, and that might be the worst-case scenario for the United States of America. There are a handful of Republican politicians nearly as extreme or slightly more extreme than Mike Pence, but none of them are in any position to make a successful run for the White House. Pence is an extremist, but he is able to smile calmly when espousing his far-right beliefs, whereas many extremists are louder, more confrontational, and therefore unpopular outside their base. Pence has a shot, and as this year's Democratic primary has shown, sometimes the well-known vice president is chosen by the establishment on name recognition alone. Americans sometimes underestimate how much power the president has. This may have something to do with social studies classes that claim that the three branches of the federal government are co-equal. The president is commander-in-chief, and in the 21st century, that power cannot be easily tempered by Congress due to a series of laws passed in 2001, 2002, and 2003. The president chooses the heads of every federal executive department, can influence federal policy in every federal department, can sign far-reaching executive orders that override the legislature, and nothing can be passed in said legislature unless it has so much bipartisan support that it can override a presidential veto. These days, bipartisan support is so rare that this contentiousness has the byproduct of granting the president that much more power due to the veto. No bipartisan support means the veto is absolute. The president is absolute. Now imagine all that concentrated power wielded by a man who believes he was chosen by God to sit in the Oval Office, that everything he believes is right, and that everything he does is divinely ordained. A President Mike Pence is the worst-case scenario for the United States, and with Joe Biden as the last hope to damage Pence's reputation by beating the Trump-Pence ticket in November, the worst-case scenario may yet come to pass.
I am here to report, as the United States military confirmed in Iraq on Monday, weapons of mass destruction have been found in Iraq, in the form of 2 separate artillery shells containing sarin and mustard gas, shells that had been used by insurgents to create roadside bombs. A 105 55mm shell